Hello and welcome to another episode of Sunday Sweet Chats. My name is Charles K. Carter and I'm a queer poet who currently lives in Oregon. I'm the author of Read My Lips from David Robert Books, as well as several chapbooks, including Artificial Sweetness from Finishing Line Press. But that's enough about me. Let's talk with our sweet guest today and discuss some sweet, sweet poetry. Hello, Damien. Can you introduce yourself to our audience?
Hello, Charles. I'm Damien B. Donnelly. First of all, I'd like to say thank you so much for having me here. It's a very big honor. I have your poetry book in the background, which mimics you with my poetry books in your background, so that's really nice. So very briefly, I worked in the fashion industry for about 25 years, lived in Paris, London, and Amsterdam. But originally, I was born here in Dublin, Ireland, and I moved back about 3 years ago, just before COVID. Got locked down in a cottage here in Ireland literally a month later with my mother. Didn't expect that to happen and decided to become a writer. I'd always done writing in the background, but it was never something that it was never in the forefront. And somehow since then, there's been two poetry pamphlets, a micro collection, a full collection, currently working on the new collection. And now, seemingly, I'm also the editor-in-chief of a journal called The Storms, and also a poetry podcast now in its 7th season. And I'm very excited to say that Charles has often been a guest on that show. So thank you very much, Charles.
It's been an honor to be on Eat the Storms, and yeah, such an honor to have you. Before we get too far into poetry, though, I'm
Yeah.
really, really curious. What is a sweet treat that satisfies your sweet urges? And if you don't know Damien, follow him on social media and you will see these intricate, beautiful baked goods that he posts and shares all the time. So I'm curious, what did you bake today?
Well, literally, what I baked today, what I baked 2 days ago, and there's still some left because it's absolutely huge, was a baked cheesecake with a lemon meringue topping. It took about 9 hours to bake the whole thing, and there was a lot of patient waiting. This is currently my favorite sweet treat. I was a chef for a time when I lived in Paris, what seems like a lifetime ago. And I don't think that joy that I had when, 20, 30, 40 people would start coming into the restaurant and it was basically me and an ex-Tamil tiger who was usually drunk, started to have to serve them all. One of the things that I love most equally about writing is you spend all this time making food, baking a cake, but the real enjoyment is when somebody sits down with you and they taste it and they smile. It's like when I used to smoke that first drag that no longer exists anymore. But I get it with food.
Oh, that's beautiful. And it's a great metaphor for poetry. So let's just transition right on into that sweet poetry. You have a poem to read to us. Go for it.
I do. All right. Well, I decided to read a poem for you from my debut full collection, Enough, which was published by the Hedgehog Poetry Press last year, almost a year ago to the day. So it's almost time for a book birthday. This collection is inspired by my love affair with Paris and also the many years that I spent living there. I left Ireland when I was 21, went to Paris for the first time and lived there for about 3 years. Then left and went to London, then to Amsterdam, and then I moved back to Paris when I was about 40 and lived there for another 5 years before returning here to Ireland. The collection itself is broken down into 6 sections, and the poem that I'm going to read for you today is from the loving section. And the reason I chose it is because I thought it was very fitting because it talks about eating, though not necessarily food. So this is called In Paris, a Pear Tasting. We ate late, always. Dinner a meal of plucked observations, as much to titillate as to taste. We devoured each other always. Before dessert added too much sweetness to our combative copulations. Sometimes I pressed my mouth so hard against your lips that you'd have to swallow your own words. Sometimes when we weren't hungry. We'd sit in the back of the darkness, naked, running our hands along each other's bodies, trying to see if it made it any easier to swallow what the other was trying to say. So not necessarily about food, more just trying to, I suppose, swallow the differences of who we were. Me and a relationship, and I suppose me and Paris as well, because in the end, I moved back to Ireland eventually. Paris is better to be a distant affair, I think, or a weekend break as opposed to a full-time commitment of a marriage.
That was a beautiful poem. Great sound elements, great visceral images, yeah, some sensuality with that food tied in there. I love
Yeah, it's nice to mix things up occasionally.
So tell us more about Enough and about your new project that you're working on.
Well, Enough, I think, was like this a project that had to happen because I moved to Paris when I was 21. Lived there for about 4 years and then moved to London, then Paris. But I always knew I'd go back to Paris. So I moved back when I was 40 and lived there for another 5 years. And at the time when I moved back, I thought it was going to be forever. I thought that was it. And I told everybody I was moving back because I was going to die in Paris. And I didn't mean literally, I didn't mean there and then. I meant, eventually, when I grew really, really old. Of course, you go back and things are always different, and you changed and she changed. So it wasn't meant to be forever. But the collection was something I think that had to happen for just book to, and literally, thanks, managed to get about 65 poems, put them together in a collection, and shut that door for now. At the moment, I'm working on a new collection, so it's just been very graciously picked up by a publisher here in Ireland. So Hedgehog Poetry Press, which are based in England, they published my first collection, my first pamphlets. But because this collection, which is called Back From Away, because it's about my return, about being away for 25 years and coming back and coming to a country that is home, and yet questioning that word because I've had so many other homes in so many other countries and so many other cities. So trying to figure out what that word means to me. I'm now living in a cottage that was built for my great-grandparents back in 1904. So I'm literally back to my roots. However, I'm adopted. Well, I was adopted as a baby. I never knew anything different, and I always knew I was adopted. But coming back to a place that is so grounded in my family's past, there's also that question of how closely the roots are entwined around me because they're not necessarily my roots. So the collection is now exploring, I suppose, origins as well as just the simplicity of a house, a home, a building, somewhere you put your belongings. I suppose it's a very personal collection, but I'm trying to find ways of it being universal, as in most of the poems are about other places that trigger memories of here, or else here when I'm triggered by memories of other places. So hopefully lots of people can relate to that in terms of movement, expats like yourself, just moving to the other side of the United States and trying to figure out, where do I belong? How do I fit in? Am I the same person I was before when I was somewhere else? Or do I have to start afresh? Do I start new?
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. And I think all of us have those journeys, even if you don't really even if you live in the same town your whole life,
Yeah.
Mentally you have those journeys, even who am I? How do I break free from this family? I mean, just coming of age, how am
Yes.
I from these people who raised me or this community who raised me? Where do I fit in with that? Do I fit in with that?
Yeah.
So I think that collection sounds really cool and wonderful, and I think it's going to be really interesting to read poems from your specific vantage point, but I think it's going to bring up a lot of things that people can relate to. which is
Yeah,
beautiful about poetry. You can write something very specifically about you, but once you give it to that audience, someone else is
yeah.
going to pick something else up from it, which is
That's
wonderful.
the incredible thing, that so often I wrote something that's felt so specific. And I had a blog and I used to write poetry on the blog all the time. And what was wonderful about that, it was WordPress, is that you had a reaction immediately. You know, people left comments. Whereas now you write a book and it goes out and you don't necessarily have that immediate response. You know, it takes, you know, a year or 2 years or whenever till you hear back. Whereas with the blog, it was very immediate. And what was always strange was that I would write something and I would think, this is the poem that everyone's going to love. And it just went quietly away. And then I'd write something and I would find, this is so specific. You know, this is me being really angry at this point about this thing. And people would just generate to it and go, oh, yes, because like 20 years ago, something like that happened to me. And I was thinking, wow, yeah, somehow we all find our way in. And it's not the way that when you write a poem, you think this is going to be the little opening I'm leaving for everybody. And somehow they come in via another line or another word or another suggestion. And I really like that.
I love that. That kind of stirred a few thoughts in my head. One was kind of thinking, as a poet, we don't always know where we're going or what's going to be accepted, or like sometimes, yeah, like this poem's great, but it's crickets. Or the poem, you're like, oh, it's a weird poem. I thought about, like, I had that in Splinters behind you.
Yeah.
Is it Vampire? I can't remember if it was called Vampire. There's a little weird poem in there, and I'm like, this is weird. Maybe it shouldn't even be in here. But I had like 3 people who were like, that was one of my favorites. I love that one. It's like,
yeah.
Okay, I don't know. I don't
But
know what people want. And
that's what's lovely. Like now because I have the journal, so we're working on the 3rd issue. We've just closed submissions. We're putting it together. Every issue has been a different editor, sub-editor, because I always wanted sort of a different voice. It's not just my opinion. So we had Gaynor Kane, who's a Belfast poet from Northern Ireland, for the first one, Eilín de Paor from Dublin for the second one, and now I have the extraordinary Nita Casa. So Nitty is a Congolese Irish poet. So she's really going to bring in sort of a different element to it. But what's extraordinary is having this opportunity of exploring how other people are answering a call. So usually there is a theme. This time it was shelter, sanctuary, and sanctum. And it's extraordinary, the diversity, how people find a way even just into a theme. And you're reading through it and you think, oh, everything's going to be just about this. And you realize, no, it's there's so many different angles. The creativity, how people latch onto an idea, take it and swim somewhere completely differently, I think is just extraordinary. It's an honor to be able to read and view, because it's poetry, prose, and visual arts. So I feel very lucky right now, also with the podcast, being able to host a podcast that's had 520 guests so far over 7 seasons. I still think it's just me and my mother tuning in. I still find it weird when other people say, oh, you host this, Eat the Storms. But right, I've just put together the Pride episode. So I've got my Pride t-shirt on. I feel so honored that as a gay man, who grew up in the 80s and 90s in Dublin, where it wasn't possible really to find a platform to share your voice. There was, an underground club that you could go to, but that was about it. But now to be able to put together an episode, and we had poets taking part from every continent, every member of the LGBTQ plus community, sharing their voice. If I was a kid and I was listening to that, I would feel so much better, so much happier, so much more part of a community, that it really is a joy to be able to do and to bring people together, hopefully.
And that's such important work. I'm kind of getting teary thinking of some of that, because I know we were kind of talking before we started recording that I just left a teaching position in a very conservative state in the US, and some of the things going on there are banning those types of books. And I know for me, as like the gay kid in the late or early 2000s, in a very rural area where there weren't many out people, like being able to go to the public library or the school library and check out a book and see there's people like me, like probably saved me. And just knowing that we're seeing people rip those opportunities away from people to belong and feel connected and whole as a person is just horrifying. But I mean, I'm so appreciative to see people like you giving that space. I think I participated last year on the Pride episode. It's so great to see these opportunities in these places flourish, even amongst some of the pushback in the world.
But it's like you said, you know, when we were younger, we didn't always see it, or it was difficult to see it. I know even for my generation, it was so much better than the one previous to that and the one previous to that, you know. So it's felt like every generation we've come that bit further to maybe this point, because now it feels we're on this sort of precipice of falling back so far. And I know what it was like to grow up and to feel unidentified and to feel that I had to hide away. And I think one of the reasons that I'm a poet now, one of the reasons that I love to paint, that I love to write, that I love to bake, is I want to make up for all those times where I couldn't express myself. And now I want to express myself in everything, you know, whether it's singing badly or dancing, you know, I just want to do it because there was a long period where that wasn't possible. And you know, I just wish and hope and pray that, you know, for the next generations that keep flourishing, that they can grow up and as early as they want, they can feel like they can just have a voice.
I think that's so important. I think so many of us from different types of communities and backgrounds, there's so much about voice silencing and conformity that it's, you're doing a lot of the hard work to help continue to open those doors for people and modeling that as a person. And I appreciate that. That's why I'm so honored that you are here with us having this conversation.
Right back at you. Right back at you, because you know you're doing the same thing. You know, you put a pen to a book, you write a poem, you share your experience, and that's what it is. Like, people can go into a bookstore, people can go into the library, they can pull out your book and they can read your words. It's a gift that, you know, so many people didn't get. So congratulations, and thanks to you, Charles, too.
It's kind of hard to I'm someone who's been conditioned not to take the positivity, so it's hard to take that sometimes, but thank you. I appreciate it. Moving on from all your beauty and expression here.
Yeah.
It's a really salty world at times. You were just talking about how in some ways it feels like things are reverting backwards, which is horrifying. With all this saltiness in the world, how do you stay sweet? What keeps you grounded and sweet? Besides the food.
From this, aside from that, which literally, you know, we do need to end soon because I need to eat it. It's looking at me now for 20 minutes. Strangely enough, so during COVID, when we all needed something, you know, when we all needed, my God, anything, just a moment, anything out of the bitterness, anything out of the hurt, the anger, the frustration, the sadness, the loss. What I discovered, and especially having just moved back to Ireland just before it. So I moved back to Ireland thinking I was going to explore Ireland and like find old friends and new friends. Got locked down in a country village. I'm outside of Dublin, so I'm by the sea. So my 5 kilometers, at one point you can only go 5 kilometers. So it was literally around a country lane to the edge of the sea and back again. Like, I didn't see anyone. But the sweetest thing that happened, and that's still happening, and it's testament to us being here today, is the community, the writing community that I discovered that welcomed me, welcomed my voice, welcomed my poetry, welcomed, you know, my cakes, my baking, my need to show and photograph my cakes and my baking. That went beyond the social distancing. That meant that we were all in Zoom rooms and listening to the podcast, being all around the world, and yet we didn't need a plane ticket and we didn't need any kind of travel. And people like us who, as I was saying earlier, just before we started, that even though we've never met, I feel like I know you, and this is a real safe, and I know it's a safe and comfortable space. That was probably the sweetest thing, and the sweetest thing that has continued, because I met people online and I've rarely had a bad experience, and I know there are really lots of bad experiences out there, but I feel blessed and honored that everyone I've met along the journey has kind of stayed, and I've become a part of their journey. And it's like baking a cake, you know, when you get all the right ingredients together, and then it's like a little bit more, and then that topping is going to go, and then, you know, a little bit of this, and then suddenly the cherries on the cake, and we're all enjoying it together. That's it. The writing community. This, here, you, thank you. This is what makes it.
That is such a sweet note to end on. Thank you for being here, Damien. Been a sweet treat to have you. It's such a pleasure to have anyone who's watching and viewing as part of this community. Thank you for being here for Sunday Sweet Chats. Catch another episode next week. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Charles. Bye-bye.